Hello, I'm Fred Rosenbaum. I'm the scholar in residence for the East Bay International Jewish Film Festival. I'm now recording a talk on the film Polish Women. Now, because this is recorded, it means that there won't be any Q&A, but please send me an email or be in touch with me afterwards. I will get back to you. I'm interested in any comments or questions you might have. Now, the immigration of 2 million European Jews to the Americas, from 1880 to 1920, that was a sea change in our history, surpassed in importance only by the Holocaust and the creation of the State of Israel. You know, in 1840, there were only 15,000 Jews in the United States. A century later, on the eve of the Shoah in Europe, we numbered almost 5 million, and we were spared the catastrophe. Let's look at the first slide. You see those who crossed the Atlantic in this period. A large majority settled in our country, in the northeast of our country. 1.75 million Jews. But many others immigrated to South America. And we see here an immigration of over 100,000, but those populations grew over the generations. Today, Argentina alone has about 200,000 Jews, and Brazil about 100,000. Okay, we can remove that slide. Now, this mass movement to the West, which included the forebears of many of us learning together tonight, invigorated Jewish life with creativity, prosperity, security. But there was a dark, shameful chapter in the immigration story, often suppressed or simply avoided by historians. And the film Las Polacas, the Polish Women, vividly reveals it. In the course of this exodus from the old world to the new, tens of thousands of Jewish women and girls were duped by Jewish crime rings and forced into prostitution. Now, although the movie is centered in Rio de Janeiro, the tentacles of the largest criminal cartel, called Tzvi Migdal, reached across the world. Warsaw, Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, Johannesburg, Shanghai, New York's Lower East Side. The human trafficking, at that time referred to by reformers as white slavery, brought untold suffering and misery to those who were confined to the brothels. The film graphically shows us the disease, beatings, rape, even murder. And recent research has confirmed the immense scale of the ruthless brutality suffered by Jewish females at the hands of these gangsters. Of the roughly 20 films that I've discussed for the festival over the last few years, this was the most painful for me to watch and research, because the savagery inflicted upon Jews was inflicted by other Jews. And the predators are not trapped in some totalitarian system with little choice. You know, think of the Judenrat in the Warsaw Ghetto. No. For these traffickers, the motivation is simply greed and domination. It's so repugnant that we would rather look the other way. But in the last 2 decades, there has been a growing consensus among Jewish scholars and artistic creators that in the long run, we're stronger as a people when we face our failings as well as celebrate our achievements. The award-winning film, Polish Women, played in 4 Jewish film festivals before this one: Atlanta, Miami, Phoenix, and Boca Raton. Let's look at the next slide. This subject came to light in 2005 with the publication of Bodies and Souls by a dedicated and I would say fearless investigative reporter, Isabel Vincent from Toronto. She had earlier pierced a wall of secrecy with a book disclosing how Swiss banks laundered and lent money to the Nazis. Vincent had the tools to explore the sordid story of Jewish prostitution in Rio and Buenos Aires. Having grown up in a Portuguese family and being fluent in that language and in Spanish. But unsurprisingly, few people she wanted to interview were forthcoming. Only 1 of 10 whom she contacted was willing to talk to her. She found that key Jewish community records in Rio went mysteriously missing. And she was also hampered by the loss of the Buenos Aires Jewish archives in the horrific suicide bombing in 1994 that killed 85 people and destroyed the community headquarters there. But she assiduously gathered police reports, trial transcripts, rare memoirs, hospital and cemetery records, and of course, newspaper clippings, which enabled her to trace the harrowing experiences of 3 Polish Jewish prostitutes in South America, 2 in Rio and 1 in Buenos Aires. The film, which is based on this book, is a composite. It portrays one young woman, Rebecca, by drawing upon the experiences of all 3 whom Vincent chronicled. Let's look at the next slide. In the movie, the central character, Rebecca, is played by the popular young Brazilian actress, Valentina Herzaga. Of Polish Jewish ancestry in real life. We see her immigrate to Rio with her young son, expecting to reunite with her husband, who has gone before her. And this was a typical pattern in North and South America. The husband goes first and then brings over the family. But she soon learns of his death, which leaves her vulnerable and easy prey for a well-dressed, smooth-talking procurer and bordello owner. Yet, in fact, most of those caught in the net of human trafficking, they were snared well before they got off the boat, even before they got on the boat. They were caught while they were still in Eastern Europe, usually taken away as young teens who were growing up in religious families in impoverished shtetls. Now, how did this nefarious scheme unfold? It must be understood in the context of the desperate, often hopeless poverty in the 19th and early 20th centuries, even before the devastation wrought by World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution. In the backwaters of the Austrian and Tsarist empires, especially in the region of Galicia, which is today in northwest Ukraine, living conditions had changed little since the Middle Ages. Even while Jews were beginning to flourish in the big cities like Warsaw, Lodz, Odessa, of course, Vienna. On the countryside, most were crowded under thatched roofs, the men working as peddlers or artisans, barely earning enough to feed their large families. They lacked electricity, running water, decent roads. Medical care was primitive, and secular education woefully inadequate. Jews faced blatant discrimination in the civil service and the military. On top of all this, the trauma of ferocious pogroms. So into such a shtetl would come a kind of Jew rarely seen before. Handsome and dapper in a frock coat and a top hat with a gold pocket watch, spotless boots of fine-grained leather, carefully manicured hands, in citified, high-flown Yiddish. He'd say he made a fortune in America, often conflating North and South America, and was looking for a girl to work one of his enterprises in a great metropolis. He promised that she would travel by train to a famous port city like Antwerp or Hamburg. That itself was an inducement. Then she would cross the Atlantic, earn a lot in a short time, send money home, and then return. You would give her father an advance payment on the spot. Sometimes the dandy would come and claim he was looking for a wife. The women in America not being virtuous enough. And marriages were entered into almost immediately. These makeshift weddings were called stille chuppah, silent chuppah, often without a rabbi, but with two witnesses, vows, and the exchange of something of value. Although these marriages had no binding effect in civil law, they were considered valid in Jewish law. And most of the girls believed that they were married even after they were later abandoned by their so-called husbands. In Sholem Aleichem's short story, The Man from Buenos Aires, such a slippery procurer, fashionably dressed, comes to a downtrodden shtetl posing as a salesman. When asked what he's selling, he says, I supply the world with merchandise, something that everybody knows and nobody speaks of. What do I deal in? Not in prayer books, my friend, not in prayer books. Okay, we can remove that slide. Now, the easily deceived girls were very, very young, typically 12 to 14, and they were taken by associates of the trafficker who had himself disappeared, and they were put on ships in third-class berths, sent across the ocean to cities on the Atlantic coast. As I said, from New York to Rio. There, they learned their fate. They were compelled to work in brothels and had little other choice, for they were utterly without resources. Penniless, of course, not speaking the native language, lacking friends or relatives. Now, had the fathers actually sold their daughters back in the shtetl, like some indigent peasants in rural China or India did at this time? Well, not exactly. Certainly, they should have been more suspicious, of course. But they too were tricked by the fantasies spun by the procurers. These delusions persisted long after the girls left home. Why? Because the crime ring had a team of so-called professors who wrote reassuring letters home to the parents, telling them their daughters were happily settled in their new homes, living as pious girls. They often enclosed some money as well. Now, this third-party communication also served as a threat hanging over the heads of the trapped women. For these professors could also write the truth to their parents, that their daughter was a prostitute, thus shaming her forever, given the high standards of sexual purity in traditional Jewish families. Now, who was the clientele in these brothels? Well, mostly non-Jews. As one Jewish madam quipped, the men are treif, but their money is kosher. In the booming Brazilian and Argentinian cities at the turn of the century, young single men far outnumbered women. There was little of a dating scene as we might know it. Sexual relations outside of marriage was considered sinful in this Catholic country. Only a fraction of the young male population had the resources to start a family. So prostitution flourished. In the film, the clients are shown as prosperous businessmen patronizing a fancy bordello. And indeed, the wealthier men frequented such gentlemen's clubs with French and Jewish prostitutes in an upscale neighborhood. But in fact, the large majority of the Johns were of the lower classes, new immigrants who were construction workers, longshoremen, as well as soldiers and sailors, and recently freed black slaves. And these brothels were near the ports in the worst slums. In Buenos Aires, it was called La Boca, the mouth, for it was at the delta of the Rio de la Plata. In Rio de Janeiro, the red light district was located in the low-lying Mangué. That's the Portuguese term for mangrove swamp or marsh. The quarter that was the hardest hit in the city during the periodic outbreaks of yellow fever. Tuberculosis was rampant as well. The clapboard buildings were dilapidated and the streets filled with mud. By 1913, just a few years before the film is set, there were hundreds of brothels in this one rundown neighborhood alone. Most of them, hundreds of brothels, operated by Jews. And many of the prostitutes were Jewish women and girls. Let's look at the next slide. The Mangay seemed little changed a generation later when it was described by one of Central Europe's greatest authors, the Viennese Jew Stefan Zweig, who fled the Nazis first to New York and later to Rio. There he wrote a glowing book entitled Brazil, a Land of the Future. Yet Stefan Zweig's description of this seamy side of town was hardly favorable. Look at the way he writes about this. This is the district one does not talk about. The great market of love, the Mangay of Rio. Window to window, or rather door to door, 1,000 or even 1,500 women of all races and colors, of every age and origin, stand like exotic animals behind the bars of their cages, all waiting for customers in a continuous stream, pass by and glance up at the doors in order to inspect their wares. And then around this time, he wrote to a friend, Jewish women from Eastern Europe promise you the most exciting perversion. Okay, let's remove that and go to the next slide. The cold, transactional nature of sex for money in the Mangay is also captured by the woodcuts of the Jewish expressionist artist Lazer Siegel, who emigrated to Brazil in the 1920s and lived there for the rest of his life. Note the woman's expression. It's a mixture of pain and resignation. And now let's look at the next image. In this, you see Lazer Siegel frames the women in the iron cages that Stefan Zweig described. Okay, we can remove that. The local and national authorities frequently change their policy regarding the pervasive sex trade, but overall, they regarded it as what I would call a necessary evil. They sought to regulate the trade rather than criminalize it. Yes, on the one hand, Brazil has been a Catholic country. The church has no toleration for extramarital sex. Moreover, Rio was the country's capital city before the federal district moved to Brasilia in 1960 and hardly wanted a reputation for vice. Yet, it also saw itself as a cosmopolitan city, emulating Paris and Vienna, with its many coffee houses and bohemian artists and intellectuals and Art Deco architecture. More than that, Rio offered a kind of what you could say was a tropical sensuality with its famed carnival featuring rhythmic samba music and scantily clad dancers. Let's look at the next slide. Especially after World War I, the beachfronts, Copacabana and Ipanema, which enjoy warm weather throughout the year, these became the playground for tourists as well as locals. The women's bathing suits shown here would have been considered scandalous in many other cities at this time. So, another dimension of life in Rio. Okay, we can remove that. So, in this pleasure seeking environment, the city fathers could hardly deny male desire. But they wanted Rio to be respectable as well. So that meant a compromise, limiting the ladies of the night to certain areas of the city, registering them, and above all, requiring monthly screenings for venereal disease. Needless to say, whatever laws were on the books, well-connected brothel owners had little trouble bribing the notoriously corrupt police and politicians. The high proportion of Jews in the sex industry spurred anti-Semitism in Brazil. Now, no question, the damage they were doing to society was real. They ruined countless innocent lives. But Jew haters exaggerated the harm, falsely claiming that all prostitutes, pimps, and brothel owners, that all were Jewish immigrants, and that they were solely responsible for bringing this plague to the country. As early as 1876, 25 Jewish pimps were deported from Rio. While the term Las Polacas literally means the Polish women, it came to mean Polish Jewish women and was later an ugly slur toward all sex workers. Polaka had the meaning of the English word whore. Even worse, the Portuguese word for pimp is cafetão, derived from kaftan, the traditional robe of East European Jewish men. The Jew hatred peaked in the 1930s following the coup d'etat installing the fascist dictator Getúlio Vargas. Pandering to the public with anti-Semitic bigotry in the name of family values, he cracked down on vice and made a big show of raiding brothels and deporting dozens of Jewish prostitutes and pimps. He deported them back to Eastern Europe, where most were eventually killed in the Holocaust. And he drastically curtailed the immigration to Brazil of Jewish refugees from Nazi oppression. In short, the conspicuous Jewish presence in the sex trade gave nativist politicians a potent weapon in preventing Brazil from becoming the haven for Jews that it could have been. Now, the association of Jews with human trafficking was hardly the only factor, but it certainly contributed to the paltry number of only 27,000 Jews to enter the vast country from 1931 to 1945, only 27,000. And very few of them came from Poland, even though 300,000 other immigrants arrived in this period. Now, thankfully, Jewish prostitution in Brazil came to an end by the 1960s. And this is certainly not an issue today among the roughly 100,000 Jews in the country. About a quarter of whom live in Rio. Most of them are in the middle class or upper middle class. But how did the Jewish community respond a century ago to the sex trade conducted by their fellow Jews? A time when Jews were seeking a foothold in Brazilian society. Well, the Jewish population was relatively small. Only about 15,000 in a country of 30 million in 1920 when the film is set, just 15,000, with perhaps only 2,000 in Rio. And that little community had almost no political clout. As in Argentina, which drew far more Jews, many of whom had come at the turn of the century in South America, lured to agricultural settlements supported by Jewish philanthropists like Maurice de Hirsch, with the goal of changing the image of the Jew from that of an economic middleman to a productive farmer. And we see a reference to that late in the film. But these attempts failed due to the lack of expertise and equipment. So these former Jewish gauchos migrated to cities where they worked primarily as peddlers or shopkeepers. They were fearful that the high Jewish profile in the sex trade could tarnish the reputation of all Jews, which indeed happened, as I've mentioned. They were also outraged on moral grounds. But unable to impede this vice, their reaction was simply to shun the impure ones, as they were known. The ostracism was so great that one of the earliest journalists to investigate this topic termed the pimps and prostitutes as the Jews of the Jews. In the film, we see Rebecca and her son kicked out of the Jewish home they're staying in, simply because she returns there from a brothel. The impure ones were banned from synagogues, from philanthropic organizations, from the Yiddish theaters and kosher restaurants. Most importantly, they were refused burial in Jewish cemeteries, thus cast out even in death. And death at an early age was omnipresent in the brothels. Disease and poor medical care, physical assaults, and suicides. One is included in the film. All of these took a terrible toll. The women could not be part of the Jewish community, but the Jewish religion, comforting faith that had structured their lives in shtetl, that remained close to their hearts. Now, of course, prostitution is generally considered immoral in the Bible and Talmud, but there are some mixed messages about it in the classical texts, and repentance is possible. For the Jewish sex workers in South America, the traditional ritual of tahara, cleansing the body before burial and signifying purification. This ritual took on special meaning, as is shown with such feeling in the movie. But where to lay the dead to rest? Because they were excluded by the organized Jewish community, the only options were the Catholic cemeteries or the paupers' graveyards, known as Potter's Fields. So remarkably, they formed their own burial society as early as 1906, and a decade later built their own cemetery on a large flat field that they bought in a suburb of Rio called Inhumana. They hired workers to clear the land and erect walls and a gate, and built a room for the Tahara purification ceremony with proper drainage for the waters. They constructed fountains for the mourners to wash their hands. Almost 1,000 women, girls, and babies were buried there over the next half century. The established Jewish community in Rio was not impressed. An editorial in the local Jewish press chastised the sex workers, saying they should be in jail, and regarding their cemetery, callously declared, "We are not connected with them in life or in death." But the prostitutes had a powerful advocate, one of their own, with organizational skills, who was respected throughout the city. Rebecca Friedman, known as the Queen, was 35 years old when she arrived in Rio after already working in a brothel in Eldridge Street in New York's Lower East Side, near today's Tenement Museum. She lived all the way to 104 and passed away in 1984. Yet this was still long before investigative reporter Isabel Vincent could interview her. But for decades, Friedman worked closely with a loyal assistant, Alberto da Costa, the non-Jewish custodian of the Inhumana Cemetery. And his candid recollections proved invaluable to Isabel Vincent as she pieced together the story. She learned that thanks to Rebecca Friedman, the sex workers' Jewish communal life was vibrant. Friedman was the longtime president of the tightly knit Society of Truth, or Chesed Shel Emes, as their burial and benevolent society came to be known. Peaking at 120 dues-paying members before the war, they called each other sisters, and the board members were sister superiors. The women davened in makeshift quarters, and in the 1940s, the society bought a building in downtown Rio that they converted to a synagogue and administrative offices, and even a Hebrew school for their children, who were sometimes born and bred in the brothels, like the woman in the film whom Rebecca befriends. The Society of Truth was located in a lively middle-class Jewish neighborhood not far from Rio's largest and most prestigious synagogue, Grand Israelite Temple, built a decade earlier. So every Friday night, the so-called respectable Jews could no longer avert their eyes from those they had so disdained and rejected. Still, the rabbis and cantors in town would not conduct their services. So Rebecca Friedman enlisted a knowledgeable Jewish tailor to do so. His voice was so melodious that non-Jews sometimes stood outside the synagogue to listen. Friedman's shamus was the trustworthy Alberto, who helped her manage the cemetery. He was often needed to eject young men from the services, gawkers, in the words of Isabel Vincent, who were sometimes kicked out by the women worshippers themselves. Now, with the immigrants from the interwar period, well into middle age by the 1960s, Jewish prostitution fell off sharply. At the same time, the neighborhood deteriorated and the society's building there, including the synagogue, was sold, later demolished. The society itself disbanded, and in the 1980s and 90s, its cemetery was vandalized and desecrated and used by local criminals to conceal drugs and weapons. Only since 2010 has the city recognized its historical significance and taken steps to restore it, an effort backed by at least some members of the city's Jewish community, such as a group of women from a local conservative synagogue who held a Shabbat service in honor of Las Polacas. Their rabbi, a native of Rio who had lived many years in the United States, approved the event, which he said, quote, united the sacred and the profane. But other Jews objected, still seeking to distance their community, now 30,000 strong, from the quote unquote impure ones. Now, the film certainly generates sympathy for the prostitutes and even admiration for their resilience, their unity, their devotion to Judaism amidst the constant degradation and violence they suffered. But no such pity extends to the pimps and especially the human traffickers. We see one of them brought to justice by the courageous Rebecca, and indeed, many members of the Tzvi Migdal cartel in Rio were arrested around this time, World War I, and deported to Eastern Europe. Let's look at the next slide. This is Luis Tzvi Migdal, head of this notorious crime ring. It's interesting that in the film, the brothel keeper is named Tzvi. But the sex trade was so widespread that even this action in 1918 of the arrests barely had any effect. Many of the pimps returned to Brazil and carried on as before. The Tzvi Migdal crime ring was eventually toppled, but that was accomplished not in Rio, but in the very heart of its operation, Buenos Aires. It had been formed there back in 1910, and by the 1930s ran an astonishingly large global network, including thousands of brothels in Argentina alone. Many hundreds of Jewish mobsters were involved. Okay, we can remove that. Okay, if you could put up the next slide, please. Now, one prostitute they abused, Rachel Lieberman, Raquel Lieberman, was instrumental in bringing down this mighty criminal enterprise that also included smuggling and gambling. She was the first with the courage to go to the authorities and have the good fortune to tell her story to a federal police commissioner long acquainted with the savagery of the cartel, a cop who could not be bought or intimidated. He was sorely in need of a victim's testimony, and in 1929, he finally had that from Rachel Lieberman. She had been duped by falling in love with a procurer in Warsaw, brought her to Buenos Aires, where she was forced into prostitution for 5 years. During that time, she saved enough to leave the underworld and open an antique shop. But her money was stolen by another pimp whom inexplicably she had recently married. And so she threatened to go to the police unless the funds were returned. The hitmen of Tzvi Migdal reacted by beating her and destroying her antiques, the antiques in her store. But rather than deterring her, these vicious tactics only strengthened her resolve. She knew they could simply kill her, but she would not back down. Lieberman's sworn statement led to sweeping arrests throughout the Argentine capital, more than 100 arrests over a 10-day period. The local Jewish community, much larger and more confident than Rio, cooperated with the police and provided them further evidence. So there you have a very different pattern in terms of the reaction of the local Jewish community. Now, to be sure, some of the chief members of this syndicate had been tipped off and they fled to Brazil or Uruguay. Nearly all those tried were convicted, but many received light sentences. So the Tzvi Migdal cartel was not entirely crushed. Yet by 1935, when the prosecution concluded, the organization was formally banned and greatly diminished. Jewish prostitution continued in Buenos Aires through the 1950s, but in much smaller numbers. Okay, we can remove that. Now, as prevalent as Jewish prostitution was during the immigrant period, it likely would have been even more widespread had it not been for the efforts of a group of activists, especially in Western and Central Europe and in the United States. They not only brought worldwide attention to the scourge of white slavery, then the leading feminist issue except for women's suffrage. They also waged a campaign to warn unsuspecting females of the dangers they faced. Foremost among the reformers was Bertha Pappenheim. Let's look at the next slide. There is Bertha Pappenheim, brave and outspoken in her crusade against sex trafficking. She not only sought to help the victims, but also to expose the perpetrators, including the Jewish predators among them. At the same time, she forcefully countered the virulent anti-Semitic propaganda of her time that unfairly used the Tzvi Migdal crime ring to portray Jews as inherently immoral. And you see on the right, there's a poster that she sent around to the large ports of embarkation. This says urgent warning to immigrant women. And then it says that, you have to really be on guard if you're traveling and know where you're going. And it even gives an address as to where to report anything that you think might be suspicious or something happening to you. So she did her best to try to protect women who were on their way to America. Pappenheim wanted to get to the roots of prostitution by raising the standing of females in society so they would be less vulnerable. As founding president of the League of Jewish Women, which she led for 2 decades, she fought for equal education and job opportunities, including posts in Jewish institutions. For 27 years, she ran a large shelter near Frankfurt for single mothers in distress and their children. Now, as a young woman in Vienna, she had been diagnosed as hysterical by Dr. Josef Breuer, a follower of Freud. She is the famous Anna O in the Annals of Psychoanalysis. This arbitrary label of hysteria, almost exclusively pinned on females at that time, reflects the misogyny she was battling against. Okay, we can remove that. Let me conclude now with the thought that while we're repelled by the Jewish sex traffickers and appalled by the scale of their operations, we can take some comfort in knowing that this iniquity was exposed by Jews, such as Stefan Zweig and Leiser Siegel, and effectively combated by undaunted and highly capable women like Rebecca Friedman, Rachel Lieberman, Berta Pappenheim. Friedman and Lieberman show the agency of the sex workers themselves. And this has been the focus of recent gender-based scholarship in this field. They did not want to abolish the world's oldest profession. They themselves, at a certain point, freely chose to continue to earn a livelihood from it. But they struggled to put an end to the exploitation, that is, the violence, corruption, prejudice that permeated it. Some academics now view the study of prostitution as a subset of labor history. But whether or not sex trade is just another form of work, luring underage girls into selling their bodies is something else entirely. And of course, trafficking of minors continues in our own day, even in the United States. The film makes that point at the end. It's disturbing that in recent years, a Jew, you all know his name, you've probably been thinking of this as I've been speaking, Jeffrey Epstein has become the most infamous American perpetrator of it, and his case has fueled conspiracy theories about Jewish sex rings. We have to fight the two-front war that Bertha Pappenheim did a century ago, supporting efforts to root out this evil, even if it implicates Jews, while at the same time firmly standing up against those who would blame the whole Jewish community for the crimes of a few. Thank you.